Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon session, Command and Control. How do we future-proof the grid? It's been a good afternoon. So we have a distinguished group of experts here. So we're going to start off with some short introductions to get everyone kind of set for the panel. But so what I'd like everyone to do is start with Rob on our far, your left, and just tell us a little bit. Try to keep it 1 minute, I would say, so we can jump in it. But also, tell us, each one of you, to answer this, when you were young, what did you imagine you wanted to be when you grew up? There you go.
Well, I didn't expect to be here, so I can tell you that much. Rob Hartway, Honeywell Smart Energy and Thermal Solutions. Super quick background. Been in the industry for 35 years, spent the first 10 working with the electric utilities. Then went into services, consulting, ultimately ended up with Honeywell about 17 years ago, and drive what we call our digital solutions group. What I was balancing between a pirate and a race car driver. So
nice.
Those were my dreams. So being an electric utility economist was not, it was a little bit different.
Kevin.
Check. All right. Kevin Chandra. I'm here with Austin Energy. What did I want to be when I was younger? I do feel like I'm still young, but when I was even younger than this, I definitely wanted to be a pilot, which is great until you realize you're scared of heights. You're pretty far up with that. But right now, I'm a manager of our distribution protection group. I've been using energy for 29 years, and I've been at Austin Energy for 8 of those years.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phil Nevels. I am Director of Corporate Strategy at AES. I'm curious how many folks are familiar with AES, but we're not actually a utility, though we get lumped in and we get discussed as a utility. But we do own a couple utilities in AES Indiana and AES Ohio, some utilities in El Salvador. I don't actually work in the utility part of the business, but as Director of Corporate Strategy, we look at AES as a portfolio company, think about all the different businesses that we want to be in and what our mix should look like over the long term. And so we're also in renewables, we're in solar, we're in wind. We've got some gas, we've got some coal, we got a lot of different things. But in terms of what I wanted to be when I grew up, an astronaut. I wanted to be an astronaut. My grandmother told me this horrifying story of a man who got lost in space, which I learned later that she totally made up. But that scared me, and I decided not to be an astronaut.
Hey, Sean.
Yeah, I'm Sean Hoyt. I'm with ConEd, been there for the past 17 years. My role is focused on widespread cross-sector collaboration to really transform and have an equitable clean energy commitment, successful clean energy commitment, that is. Like my fellow panelist, I kind of didn't think I wanted to be an astronaut, but I really liked the Jetsons growing up. And energy has the ability to transform communities. Look at all the movies that are out right now, whether it's Dune, whether it's Star Trek, the Infinity Stars for the Avengers, right? So I think we're kind of there right now, so maybe I wanted to be a utility worker this entire time.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. We're talking about future-proofing the grid, and this conversation has come up throughout the conference in different forms. But as you just heard the introduction, we got a good cross-section, a representation from the industry, and I'm encouraging you guys to steal my thunder. You guys chime in, and they want to hear from you. They're not so much here to hear from me, you guys. So let's start off with the big one. We want to future-proof the grid. Where do we start? Where do we put those efforts at there? And Kevin, I'll start with you.
Ooh, all right. How do we future-proof the grid? So I'll kind of start with a statistic, because as an engineer, we love numbers. So most customers, they spend 10 minutes thinking about the grid every year. And the top 2 things that they think about is my power's out or my bill's too high. So that kind of tells you the focus of a majority of our customers. I know it's not the people in this room. We think about it all day long. How it can be better, how it can be cleaner, more reliable, more engaged, et cetera, et cetera. But that is our average customer. So I want us to kind of step into their shoes as we look at this conversation together and we talk about technology and policy and programs and how we can actually make an impact on those. So kind of taking the first bullet there, reliability. This is a really big part of it. At the end of the day, if we cannot deliver reliable service, it doesn't matter where that energy source comes from. Customers have expectations that their power is going to be on. And if we don't meet that, we can't even have a conversation. I think all of us remember Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Mara. The first thing a lot of our customers did after those events is they ran and they got a Generac or a diesel generator. They did not turn to solar. They did not turn to batteries. They did not turn to clean energy. And this is part of the challenge that we have in this room today is how can we take some of those challenges around resiliency and reliability and turn those into clean energy conversations. So excited to figure that out together.
Thanks. And Rob?
Yeah, I was going to say, add to that, it's really the education is the first step. But I'm going to go back to the statement you made about 10 minutes thinking about so that's good, because when I was at Accenture and we did a study, it was 9. So you see, it's tracking upwards. It's tracking upwards. You know, by the time I retire, it'll be 11 minutes a year that we spend on it. But I think it does everything that does tie back to that level of education first. You know, I was going to say, you know, going from energy sustainability, resiliency, and energy equity, but then I realized that was triply redundant because you can't have sustainable energy if it's not reliable and if it's not affordable. And I think part of that challenge there too is also helping through that education, understanding the affordability of sustainable fuels. Like you said, going back to people run straight to a generator or something else, not realizing that there are a lot of other options available to them. I will tie it to the last part, though, the energy equity. I think one of the big challenges, I say we, I'm not a regulator or a utility, but I'm going to pretend for a minute. I think one of the big challenges is you know, there's a large group that could most use some of these new technologies and capabilities, and they're the least able to afford it. So working out ways that we can have that energy equity, and there's certainly a lot of ways to do that.
And Sean, I see you shaking your head. You want to build off a little bit about that?
Yeah, just to your last point. 2 years ago, I was on a panel here at ETS. It was focused on, what was it, games that year? We had all the video games in the lobby, et cetera.
Power Up. Yeah.
And the panel I was on was the Grid Edge playbook, right? And I likened it to the game Pac-Man, because Pac-Man was sitting right outside the room that I was presenting, and it just came to me that you know, energy affordability is probably at the center, right? Beyond reliability and resiliency. And that's because we have all these grid edge sort of solutions, we have all these incentives, we have all these different technologies that are in the market, but a lot of customers can't afford it, or they're not aware of how to utilize it. And back to the Pac-Man analogy, level 1 is like your very, very sophisticated commercial industrial customer has a capital project plan where they know exactly where to go, right? A team to actually pursue these incentives and deploy the technology. Level 200, small commercial customer in a disadvantaged community. They don't have access to the internet, right? They don't have access to any sort of capital so that they could really pursue and purchase and implement the technology. So the digital divide is part of that conversation, but really the education is also part of it. So educating across the board the market on how we could successfully deploy the solutions across the board. I think that should be a priority.
Thanks. And Phil, you've been working on these questions from your career, both past and the current. Where do you see that priority from your perspective that maybe provides a different angle than what we've heard from the rest of the panel?
Yeah, and I'll sort of merge the two. And I didn't mention before AES, I was at Exelon, so I do have some utility experience, but I'll merge the two. I mean, I think, and this is touching on some of what Kevin just said, I think that getting more renewables in the system is #1 priority. And I think from a existential threat to the environment, to the global health is one reason. But I also believe in getting more renewables in the system, we can support better customer outcomes. And when I talk about renewables, I'm talking about it both at the transmission and at the distribution level. If you were in the previous panel where Dan took a lot of the things I was going to say around dynamic line ratings, if he's in the room. Yeah, so he took a lot of what I was going to say about that. But the thing that we're trying to solve for, and I think that we need to solve for, is how do we get more renewables at the transmission level? A lot of that has to do with how do you improve these interconnection queue times, and a lot of that has to do with how do we use the existing infrastructure more efficiently and effectively. And dynamic line rating is an example of that. But even at the distribution level, again, to the extent we get more renewables on the system there, more DER in general there, whether it's renewables, whether it's EVs, et cetera, we have, the way I talk about it is this convergence of the customer needs and utility needs, right? We're all trying to save money. We all want to breathe clean air. So to the extent we can get more customers with more of these DER, and I think this does get to the affordability point as well, then the grid can leverage the customer to achieve grid outcomes, and the customer hopefully can get many of its needs met through the assets that it has behind the meter.
Yeah, I think you all touched on that. So we think about the centralized grid moving to something more decentralized. In that, if you think about a line, you're moving towards, sort of going back to the title, the main title, command and control. You're trying to give more control maybe to third parties, maybe to customers, but then the reliability factor. This is coming probably at a much faster rate than it has in the past 10 years to all of these guys on the panel. So when you think about that, how should the audience be thinking about managing that risk and balancing that risk, where on the other side of that is customers are going to try to find a solution, right? And we want to help them hopefully be part of that solution. So Sean, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think it really depends on a number of factors. So geography is one. And I'll give an example back to incorporating renewables into the grid. So at ConEd, when I started my career 17 years ago, I was in the union, electrician by training, building substations left and right to meet demand. From there, I went on to the non-wires alternative section, where my job was to defer the build of the same infrastructure that we were building when I started the company. Part of my role in the union was also decommissioning Hudson Ave, which is it's a power gen station that was really feeding One World Trade before it went down on 9/11. Where we are today is now we're replacing that decommissioned substation with the Brooklyn Clean Energy Hub, which is going to be capable of onboarding 1,500 megawatts of offshore wind and 6,000 megawatt capacity, looking at all clean energy solutions for that community. Now, when you look at the south, where we are right now, the primary heating system, whether it's domestic hot water or space heating, is electric right now. Not necessarily heat pumps, but it's electric. And in Georgia, 2 of the biggest coal-fired plants live there. They generate 7,000 megawatts of electricity combined, right? So with that transition, what we're doing is supported by legislation widely, right? We have the Community Leadership and the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, whereas in Georgia, they don't have any climate policy to support a lot of these different types of solutions. So when you think about the technologies that customers are looking for, I think making sure that those systems, those electric systems in the south where there are coal-fired generation, control those systems is very important, right? So you can reduce the load on the customer's end, whereas at ConEd in our service territory, the primary fuel source is natural gas for space heating and cooling. So we need to replace all of that with, so it's the opposite problem, where in Atlanta and Georgia, they have already the electric system in place on the customer side, and they're waiting for the grid to clean up. Whereas up north, the grid's already primarily clean or cleaner, and we're waiting for the customer side to clean up. So it just kind of depends on where you are.
Anyone want to add to that there?
Yeah, I'll jump on there. Honeywell's being in a slightly different position in the sense that we develop products and solutions for end customers, whether it's residential customers like the smart thermostats, which I think that's probably what Honeywell is best known for, to commercial building management systems, energy management systems. But then at the same time, the business unit I'm in is solutions directly for utilities, where we go to the end customer, but on behalf of the utility. So whether it's designing, developing operating programs to help with that. And then more recently, bringing in from our industrial side of the business, large battery energy storage, which can go behind the meter straight to the customer otherwise. It's an interesting situation because, like I said, working directly with customers, anybody other than residential, it's always been a very financial decision, right? We promote energy efficiency, we promote sustainability as a way to help them reduce their bill. I mean, that's ultimately what it is, as long as they have reliable power as well. But now, luckily, with the push towards sustainability, most larger customers have ESG goals. So whether it's large corporations, utilities, and even states have ESG goals. Residential customers don't necessarily, they're still trying to find, how to reduce their bill. Although they do want to feel that they're green from that perspective. And so a big part of this is trying to get both of these groups together, right? So helping utilities, or what's the Jerry Maguire, help me help you, help me, or help me help you, help. I even forget how it's. I already messed that one up. But hopefully everybody's seen Jerry Maguire and knows that one.
Yeah, and Kevin, you recently mentioned that sometimes your job is to say no, right?
That is right. So in order to kind of keep things safe, we do have to play referee. And someone's got to be referee in the room. And unfortunately, a lot of the times that does fall on the utility to say no, or at least to explain why we have certain standards, certain restrictions, certain safety codes that need to come first. I think all of us in this room can agree we want to go home safely at night. And we believe that's the same for all of our field crews and personnel that are working on the grid. So when we're looking at these deployments and these pilot programs, who doesn't love a good pilot program in the room? We all do, right? But we have to make sure that it still is safe. And customers will approach us with, a pet project based on a goal, based on something that a startup or a vendor has sold them. And we have to hold the hard line. And we have to say, here are the requirements that it takes to interconnect with the utility. Make sure you're meeting those. We don't just come up with these. There are IEEE standards, ANSI standards, committees, people that work all day long looking at numbers and curves, et cetera, to make sure that things can connect safely. So we're kind of the buck stops here, and that does mean we have to play the bad guys sometimes on these pilot or pet projects.
Thanks. And Phil, you've kind of seen that deployment at Exelon, the utility of the future. Maybe can you draw on that, how we should be thinking of using some of those things from the past to build this grid of the future where there's much higher penetration of renewables, much more data, a lot more threats. How can you take some of those lessons learned, and we should be thinking about applying them as we go through this phase of the energy transition?
Yeah, I guess in one example I'll use, and sort of add to everything that everyone said, because there's sort of a risk management question in there as well. I think it has to do with data. Data is maybe my short answer to that, right? The more data you have, the more informed your future decisions can be in terms of how you should add new things to the grid, et cetera, et cetera. But also to your question around how do you use what's old, I sort of reflect on one example where you think about the meter, the smart meter. I'll put that in the old category now. But there's a company, Sense is one. There's multiple companies that are doing stuff like this. I'm sure you guys are all familiar, where they have a sensor that you can put into your home and you can detect usage. You can manage your usage. I can see what my devices are using, this, that, and the other. And a couple years ago when I was at Exelon, I remember one of the things they had just done was they actually included the Sense software on the Landis and Gear meters. And so there was this convergence of this new thing, which is this new sensor. It has an app where the consumers can monitor and look at their energy. But it was being incorporated into something that we're all familiar with, a smart meter that's in our home. So this is one example, I think, when I talk about this convergence, where we can start looking at the old infrastructure, if you will, and think about new ways to use it, new ways to add new technologies to it. You don't necessarily have to just throw it out altogether and replace it with something new. That's a much harder thing to do than to find ways to transition into new technologies by incorporating new technologies into old.
And a big part of getting there is the building, right? The building envelope. I think I've heard a little bit about that. And Sean, I think that's a lot of the work in your advocacy is being done, but that's also an opportunity there. Can you maybe share how that's part of this equation, or the solution to this equation we're trying to solve?
Yeah, sure. So our energy efficiency programs have really been a focal point of ours since 2009, since the energy efficiency portfolio standard. Even back then, we weren't really focusing on building envelope. We weren't an interior decorating company, right? We weren't part of that industry, even though we were. Fast forward to today, we're wholehearted looking at smart building electrification, right? So we have a statewide clean heat program, which is focused on the widespread adoption of clean heating technologies, both for space heating, cooling, and domestic hot water, and making sure that that equipment is right-sized, right? So the right sizing is with the building envelope, getting the building envelope first, so that you could right-size the equipment. Now, on top of that, we're looking at smart controls so that now you could use that asset as a resource, whether it participates in demand response, whether you have different zoning for your facility or for your building. That's the sweet spot for us. We're looking for it to tie into your building management system, or if you wanted to participate in our real-time energy management program, the entire gamut. So that's what we're really incentivizing customers to do it at ConEd. And last week I had a decarbonization event, 2-day summit, and I had the unfortunate luck of introducing a new term for our industry, heat pumpification, right? And it kind of stuck and it spread like wildfire, but that's what we're looking to do. When we say heat pumpification, it's not just installing a heat pump, it's decommissioning your traditional fossil fuel-fired system, it's incorporating the building envelope and putting smart controls on it as well.
Anyone want to add on to that?
I'm going to try to tie these two together, both the data, we'll get to maybe all three with the safety aspect, but the data and the buildings. One of the things that we have noticed as working on both sides with the utilities and the end customers is whether we call something like a smart meter a new technology or an old technology. Same thing can be said with even building management systems and a lot of utility systems. Is there's a lot of data out there and it's being analyzed, but none of these systems have the complete picture, right? So your view is not complete, and therefore the decisions you make on that perhaps are not the best. So one of the things that we're trying to do now is bring this together, helping not just helping utilities, ingest data from all these different disparate systems to provide a much more holistic view of what's going on. But then also data, like you said, whether it's a smart meter or a sense device or a building management system, to be able to get that better level of disaggregation, right? So like I said, whether it's sub-metering or analytical disaggregation. Because now, as a utility grid operator like you are, you're not, obviously like a SCADA system can tell you exactly what's happening, but it's not why. It's not why, and it's not what's going to happen next. It's just what's happening. But if you're able to bring all this data together and cleanse it, curate it in such a way that you get that better picture, you don't just know what's happening, but you know why it's happening. You saw the historical trend. Through disaggregation, you can get down, you can project forward, you can forecast forward much more accurately to have a better understanding of this trend, this problem I have, is it only going to get worse or better? But then also back with the customer, those choices they have, whether it's a building management system or something else like that, you have a much better understanding of how that might be able to help solve this problem. So it's really, there are ways to bring this together. It hasn't fully been done yet. We're starting to see it. Even the beginnings of the DERMs now are still very limited in what they do on that front, but there's a lot more that can be done.
So with all those new interconnections and new devices, so how do we manage that data and that privacy part? Because it's an exchange, right? Customers will share their information. At the same time, you have one bad incident and then it ruins it for an entire industry for a while. I know you've seen instances of that. So how should we be thinking about managing that risk reward between sharing data, who has it, and then securing it? Kevin, I'll point that zinger to you.
Sure. I think as a victim of the AT&T data breach, I think we all know that having our privacy invaded or our data lost, and having to go through the identity theft stuff and all these sort of complication that adds to whatever's going on in your daily life. This is not pleasant. It's not fun to deal with, and that's why we need to take data and privacy seriously. Whatever that information is being shared, it can get tied back to you in a certain way, and people are concerned about that and becoming even more so. I can sit here and tell you that, please take everything I have if it leads to cheaper bills, a cleaner world. But the reality is, it is personal. And this is something that I think utilities take very seriously with how we protect customer data, how we interact with customers, even when it comes to sampling or doing surveys. This is something we take extremely seriously. One thing that I would suggest when it comes to the data world, I know when we're looking at these products, these end user products, there's so many different layers. There's agreements, they're buried in legal terms. It's very difficult for customers to interpret what's actually going on. Are they really protected? How much is being shared? And I think finding a way to desimplify that would be an advantage to us. So if we can take those products and desimplify what actually the impact is on the customer to protect their data, it gives us a chance of success. And as a utility, we can facilitate a lot of these programs, which also adds more layers of agreements and legal speak. But the more that we can simplify, I think we have an advantage to start to bring the consumers on board for what we're actually doing.
So it certainly definitely sounds like a complicated approach, but it's needed given the level of data that's at risk there, which also brings up another question. And Phil, I'll let you kind of take this one. When it comes to governance, right, there's the regulators at the commission level, there's federal, they're happening in multifacets, but in this new future-proof grid, that the governance structure might need to change. But what's your take on how we can improve the governance structure, or what it should even look like, or what needs to change so that way we can make decisions faster, but also keep them safe?
Yeah, and before I get to that, I was going to talk about the data just super quick, because it reminds me of an argument I have with my wife often. Like the only thing my wife and I have in common is we both love our children. Everything else, like, we're completely different. And one of those areas is data, where I'm very casual with data. I'll just give my data because I figure, what are you going to do with it? As long as you can't take money out of my bank account, other than that, it doesn't really matter. I have nothing to hide. My wife is very controlling of her data. But I think in both of our cases, even her case or my case, and this sort of doesn't directly address your question, but I think to the extent that we can very, very clearly demonstrate the benefit of sharing the data, the consumer data, if you can tie and create transparency and tie that line between, okay, I shared this and I get this, then you're in a much better place, at least in terms of encouraging willingness of data sharing amongst consumers. I think also to the extent that, because at the end of the day, like, we can talk about there's this long list of benefits that we talk about that consumers can enjoy. I think it's really cost is really that's like 80% of it, and we can debate this, I suppose. And then maybe there's like flexibility, transparency, some of these other things. But I think that, to the extent you can create transparency around that cost savings and demonstrate the magnitude of cost savings as being a result of something that they have shared, I think that's a benefit. And then to your question around governance, et cetera, I think that there is a lot to be determined there. You have all these conversations about like DSO. I think they're still relevant. I don't talk with a utility every day, but DSO, and is it the ISO or the DSO, or is it the regular, like, who's controlling what? Who's in charge of what? I think that ultimately, regardless of who it ends up being, I think customers are going to ultimately determine, like, who that will be, who will. Even today, the incentive for utilities to care for their customers is not just because they care, but they're going to get better regulatory outcomes if their customers are happy. So today, customers have the power, and they will continue to do so. Those things that are adopted, whether it's this technology or that technology, ultimately, I think it's going to depend on what customers want and what they want to see in their homes, and customer satisfaction based on reliability, resiliency is always going to be paramount. So I think whoever is governing, it's gonna end up being based on what customers want.
All right, we have time for some questions. I'd like to open up some questions. We might need some help with the mic here. If not, I'm happy to lend out a mic here. But while we figure that out, if we have a question, can someone? Oh, Aaron.
Thank you. I'm Erin Hardick. I'm a researcher and writer for Latitude Media. We cover the energy transition. I'm curious what you all think about DER aggregation and wholesale markets. Like, do you think that's happening? I know that ERCOT, we saw the Tesla Powerwalls and ERCOT. I'm just curious, like, what kind of momentum do you see when it comes to aggregating DERs and bidding them into wholesale markets? What kind of problems does that create? Can you just kind of talk to that a little bit?
Well, I unfortunately can't speak into bidding it into the wholesale market, but the aggregating of the DERs is something that we're absolutely already starting to see just at the utility distribution level down to the end customers, and creating ways, making it easier for the end consumers to self-enroll their devices, and either the consumers, if they're a large facility, a campus, or multiple buildings, and then them being able to aggregate, so they could become an aggregator, or simply having the utility aggregate more dynamically to meet those needs. But from a wholesale market, unfortunately, I can't speak to it yet. But we're certainly seeing a lot of momentum on aggregation for the purposes of VPP at the distribution level and down.
I can't speak to ERCOT, but in New York State, we had something called REV, Reforming the Energy Vision, which was really attempting to unlock these different business models for customers. And track 3 was transformed into value of DER, right? So that's where we really started to make that progress. We aren't vertically integrated at ConEd, right? So the New York Independent System Operator manages the upstream sort of transmission system. And they put out a DER roadmap a few years ago that is pretty compelling, and it has the entire plan for how we're gonna look at that in New York State. So we have made progress, but it's continuing to evolve. And that old smart meter system, we just actually launched, we started installing our AMI meters in 2017. The majority of them are deployed, but it's really helping with us test those pricing signals. We have a couple pilots out right now that are testing the strategy.
Next, we have another question.
Yeah, Darren Sweeney with S&P Global. I was just wondering if you guys could kind of go over how you're future-proofing the grid for like the influx of data centers and AI into each of your service territories.
I was just at Sarah Week a few weeks ago. You guys put on a really good, great job with that. This is good too. So I don't know that. So I'm not going to even answer your question because I can't speak to what we're doing in our utility specifically. But I will say that what's happening with AI and data centers is of a special, huge interest for us at AES generally, because. And this does apply to the utility. Because we're anticipating something like 45 gigawatts of new capacity needs between now and 2030, and probably more than that. That's probably an understatement in terms of needs to support just the generative AI, the new AI stuff, right? On top of anything that you might have anticipated just for data centers to begin with. And so there's going to be a huge amount of huge power needs. At the same time, we're not going to be able to build fast enough. AES, like renewables, we're not going to be able to build fast enough. So the supply-demand imbalance, which there already is one, especially when you think about data centers, it's only going to increase, right? In terms of there's going to be a lot of demand for power, and there's not enough supply. And so I think that's going to be a significant potential issue in some jurisdictions, depending on, supply demand dynamics in different parts of the country. But that's the thing, we're both excited about it because there's going to be a demand. You're going to need renewables alongside geothermal, alongside some other things. But at the same time, there's going to be these significant constraints in the system. So one of my partners here I think it's a big issue that you raised.
Yeah, I can kind of speak from the utility side. When it comes to those data centers, we have a pretty large key accounts team that has those conversations with the large vendors, the large data centers, people in the tech industry, right? So they bring to us some of the ideas, some of the things they're looking at when it comes to load growth. So we have a 7-year roadmap, essentially, that outlines where these large loads are going to be in town. And in fact, we're already cutting in 5 new substations, basically in anticipation of that increased density in that load. And for loads that do exceed a certain mark, we're actually looking at transmission line solutions as well. So we have a lot of collaboration between the transmission and distribution planning side when it comes to these data centers. But at the end of the day, load is load. Whether it's data centers, AI, a subdivision, something else that's very, very dense, like a grocery store, hospital, we treat load as load. So whatever that value is, it just turns into a math problem, and you solve it from there. So in terms of that big doom and gloom and fear that a lot of folks have, I think we sort of step away from that and approach it as a load problem.
Yeah. And I was being a load problem, and that's what it is. Data centers are interesting in the sense that absolutely massive load, a load that the distribution grid wasn't there to support. The plus side is that it's a relatively steady massive load, and it's not going to pop overnight. It's saying, oh my gosh, there was a data center there that I didn't know about. So you do have some time to plan, and bring in, the balance of, put a lot of solar on the roof, batteries to help support it, to minimize the amount of T&D investments. To get there, I would say some of the ones that might even be more challenging are those that you don't have as much advance notice of and are more dispersed, like the EV chargers, whether it's residential EV chargers, which you only know about it once you see the load, but even some of the commercial chargers, yes, they still have to get it connected, but don't have nearly as much time. So finding ways to be able to support those loads and work with the consumers of that and balance it with the other resources, because especially when you get up into areas like ConEd, where you have a bunch of stuff underground, even if the load isn't overly tremendous, it could still be years and years and years till you could upgrade the transformer or something like that. So. I think again that type of thing, but it's balancing it's balancing those large loads with the renewables, but the collaboration of utility and client, and that collaboration is a combination of if the utility having a better set of tools to do that scenario analysis, and then provide the appropriate incentive, usually financial, and dynamic, not a static incentive, and you can get that supply-demand balance.
I'll just add 60 seconds because I think they all answered your question already. But to Rob's point, you have the non-network part of the grid, then you have the overhead part of the grid at ConEd. And it's built in with redundancies and resiliency. We do a 5, 10, and a 20-year load relief plan annually, where we look for those load growth opportunities so that we could plan ahead. And depending on where you're located, I think the data centers are probably going to be in the outer boroughs. So think Brooklyn and Queens, 27 kV on the distribution side, delivered. Manhattan's 13 kV, it's more densely populated. When you think about the Bronx, 13 kV as well, then Staten Island's 13 kV and 33 kV, depending on where you're located. And the mesh network, the way it operates is if you're on a street, right, and there's a street's closed, you'll still get to your destination, you'll have a detour. Right, it's the same thing on our mesh network. It detours electricity to make sure that you get it. So we build in redundancy and resiliency, and that's really how we're future-proofing the grid. We're looking at, we just released last year our climate change vulnerability study. It's the second version of that, where we're looking at external sort of components, weather change patterns, increase in sea level rise, and making sure that those assets are gonna operate under those conditions. ConEd, we're still a summer peaking system, so our main concern is in the summer. In the winter, we have about 40% excess capacity before we become a dual peaking system. And data centers and anything that's on the horizon is part of our plan.
Thank you. We have another question. We still have a few minutes here, so I was hoping you guys would save me from trying to jump back on this chair and sprain an ankle. So I'm going to save you the laughs, or maybe I should give it to you. I don't know. Oh, we have a question. Mike.
Well, from I'll buy you guys some time.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so from our perspective, we talk about the SMR stuff all the time, and the geothermal in particular. We're primarily solar and wind, and we're big advocates for that. But even we recognize the shortcomings of solar and wind, the intermittency being probably the biggest one. And there are a number of significant challenges, many of which have already been listed, challenges to getting renewables connected, whether it's the interconnection queue or land or siting or permitting and all these different things. And then when you throw on where we're talking about data centers, so I'm very sensitive to data centers because that's our largest customer segment that we serve, our data centers. Something like 40% of we do utility scale customers are data centers. And if you look at the top, like the FANG, Facebook, Amazon, the big guys, something like 50% of their megawatts are served by AES. So that's a really big segment for us. And so we're particularly focused on the AI folks. And they have told us that they're very committed to their renewables objectives, but renewables aren't coming fast enough. Solar and wind aren't coming fast enough. And so they're starting to look at some of these things like nuclear, like geothermal. And I think, I don't know all the challenges with them. There's some DOE liftoff reports. I think the geothermal one just came out pretty recently. But I think nuclear's been there for a while. And I think the biggest challenge is cost. I think just the LCOE for both of those is very high, relatively high. That's before you get into some of the political stuff around, public perception of nuclear. What do you do with the waste, et cetera, et cetera. And I think some of the advanced designs get around some of these shortcomings, but there's definitely a perception problem. There's going to continue to be an LCOE cost problem. Until you solve those, I don't think you're going to get a huge proliferation of those technologies.
But I appreciate. I was going to have to use a lifeline and call a friend. So I thank you for jumping in there for a second. Yeah. Quite serious. I'm going to have to do more research on the small scale nuclear. So maybe I can white label that and take credit because that sounds pretty cool. No, we're certainly not involved in any of those activities other than from a cybersecurity NOC perspective. But on a similar front. Did I turn myself off? Maybe that's me telling me that I'm talking too much. But on a similar front, just cost-effective alternative. I think a big thing is cost-effective energy storage, right? So we're going to, whether somehow lithium comes down or some non-lithium battery energy storage, because then suddenly this really low-cost solar and wind, which is really low cost, as long as you can turn on the sun and turn on the wind. Then you can balance that out. I mean that'll be a game changer. But yeah.
I'll just kind of speak from the utility perspective, just to give another sense of confidence that we have when it comes to these problems. Is that this is a generator problem. At the end of the day, nuclear, solar, natural gas, diesel, we handle it with the fundamentals behind it. So outside of the economics or the public perception issues, from a technical standpoint, it's a generator sync problem. Voltage, frequency, and current, phase angle. If I can nail all of those, it can parallel and connect with the grid. So just tie it back to the simplicity of what the connection is, and y'all deal with the economics and public perception later.
All right, if there's not any more questions, I think I want to thank all of our panelists here today for an excellent conversation. We touched on a variety of things, but also I think you guys can walk away with some good food for thought and some potential actions. Our guests will be here for the afternoon. Feel free to come by and ask some questions. Thanks you, everyone, for joining us.